Hello, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all up and about today on our sea day. Did you have a good time in the Seychelles? And were you there? Well, this is a remarkable part of the world, and it's a good place to get away from the cold, cruel north and come to all these beautiful places. My name again is Richard Heyman. I've been a professional mariner and merchant marine officer. I worked on all kinds of different ships around the world and have been around the Indian Ocean, certainly. But wherever you go, there's always more, and particularly when you get to stay a bit longer, because my profession and much of our travel is rather scheduled, and just when you get to know a place or make friends, that's usually when you have to go. And so today I'm just going to show you a bit about the Indian Ocean, which is, they call it the third of the great oceans between the Pacific and the Atlantic, but it's all really part of the same world ocean. And as Melville said, all land are mere islands. And we are now, of course, off of Africa, which is the greatest of islands in the sense of the Eurasia. But this particular ocean is surrounded on three sides: Africa, Asia, Australia, but it's pretty much open sea all the way down to Antarctica. And that has been dubbed as the Southern Ocean now. It's actually in the International Hydrographic Association, or the Society. They have designated the Southern Ocean around around Antarctica as its own distinct ocean, because it's the one ocean with no land blocking the circulation of the wind and currents around it. And I'll show you that. But the Indian Ocean itself is, of course, vast, some 75,000 square kilometers of water, and it stretches Africa up to Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, down to Australia. And you see, Antarctica is sort of the farthest of places, but in the current designation, the Indian Ocean ends with the beginning of the great southern currents that sweep around Antarctica. Now we know many of these places, South Africa up to Kenya. I came through Ethiopia, and the Arabian Sea, India, around down all the way to Australia. There's so many different places with their own local conditions, but they share this great ocean. Some 20 countries with about 2 billion people live on access to the ocean. I was on an Ethiopian airliner to come all the way, and I was sitting next to an Ethiopian gentleman who pointed out that Eritrea, the former province of Ethiopia, had their local war and is now independent, but that was the port for Ethiopia. And he said, now we are landlocked. And even the airliner had to fly from Europe and go around, make sure it didn't cross over the border there. So this is typical of how many places have local disputes, civil wars, but they all could get along and share access to the ocean. And of course, much of the world trade comes through the Red Sea and across to Asia. So I'll give another talk next week about just the human contact and settlement of the Indian Ocean and the trade routes that are traditional. Well, just to show you again where we are off of the African coast, we're from the Seychelles, we're coming all the way down to Réunion right now. We could have gone down to the Comoros and come down to Madagascar, but you may have followed the news that there was a terrible big cyclone that damaged so much of that area. It spared the Seychelles, though. But the Indian Ocean has these points of land that are the demarcation for oceanographic purposes. This is the Cape Agulhas in South Africa, and then you have Fort Gale in Sri Lanka, and then you go all the way down. Of course, much of Indonesia has many islands and such, but then officially the Indian Ocean is demarcated on the Australian bight, and also to Tasmania. And of course, when you're out on the ocean, there are no little road signs and borders that you bump over. This is mainly for scientific use, that they classify certain seas and certain conditions and label it which ocean it is, even though, again, the ocean has its own way around the world and is similar in many places. But the Indian Ocean was really created by the tectonic plate separation of the Gondwanan and the previous Laurasia and these geological formations that there's evidence from the rocks, but they separated, and Africa, Asia, India, Australia, they all separated, leaving all of these fractured lines. And so this is just an illustration of how the world has been made, and the continents continue to move and drift, particularly India as a landmass had moved via the separation of the Indian Ocean and has been pressed up against the Eurasian plate, and of course it has meant that the Himalayas are still rising as a mountain range because of the pressure from the deep earth that is forcing India against the Eurasian plate. But the ocean itself has all these fracture zones. This is the major one in the center, and there's another one from Indonesia down to off the coast of Australia. So this is a artist version satellite imagery of all the different subsea conditions. Of course, the Seychelles are here, and we're coming down to Réunion is right about there. We could go further south, but that's a pretty long way down to Antarctica. But the feature of all of the oceans are that they are connected, and there are very strong subsea currents scouring the abyssal plain, and then there are surface currents. And this has been called the circulation system for the whole planet, in that water is recycled from even the Arctic down through the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. Then the Southern Ocean is the great circular current. But without that kind of steady flow, there would not be the mineralization needed for plankton and the food chain. There would be very different winds, and so climatologists now are trying to understand what will happen if certain currents are affected by the rising heat of the oceans, particularly what they call the AMLO, which is the Atlantic current, which brings warm water. Actually, it comes up from the Gulf Stream over to Europe, such that the UK, which otherwise would be as cold as Labrador, is fairly warm. And then the subsea flow goes all the way to the Pacific. We don't see this on the surface because the surface has either weather conditions or such, but there are deep sea monitors that are watching what is going on, and if any of these currents change or slow or change direction even, that will have unknown effects on the climate. Particularly when you go down to the Antarctica, you have this circular flow around here, which is almost like a what I call a roundabout for the ocean currents. And they go clockwise as a proper driver should. But you can see they come all the way from the Arctic all the way down, and this is the great conveyor belt of the ocean's currents. Now, just for the Indian Ocean, we have the Red Sea, the Great Rift Valley, the opening into the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and then down the coast of Somalia. And this is, of course, a critical part of world commerce now, passing by the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the Strait of Tears, because in Arabic it was said when you either leave or come back in, you are facing new dangers. So there's a lot of loss of life right in this very narrow strait, very strong currents. If you're not in a strong vessel, you can easily go up onto various reefs around there. But worst of all, now the Houthis in Yemen are now attacking shipping, and so much of the world's commerce has been disrupted. And I was telling my Egyptian friend, this is a great problem for Egypt, because Egypt is this country needs to have the Suez Canal income, otherwise they can't feed their people. And so that's a political issue that is determined by the oceanography of getting through that narrow strait and through to the Suez Canal. But anyway, we're going down further down the coast. But you notice on the Arabian Sea, this what they call the Indus Cone, which has the remnant of previous geological areas where there were a wetter climate. The Indus River would flow in a whole canyon, and traces of it in the basin like that, even though it's very deep. This is a National Geographic map. So these are in feet, 14,000 feet just off of the other islands and shores. And then we come down the Seychelles with this rocky granite uprise, which I mentioned in my talk the other evening, was a remnant of the Indian subcontinent, but it stayed behind as the rest of the continent moved north, leaving these granite islands that make the Seychelles such a beautiful place. And then we come down Comoros Islands, Madagascar, and again we're going to go further down toward La Réunion. Again, the basins are very deep. The sea continental shelf is very short on the east coast of Africa. So you have a lot of deep sea resources right along this coast, which is why it was always good fishing until the trawlers came in and took much of it away from the local people, let's say. But then you come down to the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Town, and the Argujas Plateau, and currents are very strong down here. Because of the subsea current, also the contrary winds to the waves, that makes it one of the most rogue wave prone and dangerous parts of the world for navigation. And every year, 2 or 3 major ships break up off of the southern coast of South Africa. And so that in sailing instructions back in the age of sail, you would only go seasonally when the conditions allowed. Now, much more traffic, having been diverted from the Red Sea, is coming around there. And again, the bigger the ship, the more they're prone to failure in big waves. But we're not going there. But you can see over on the Australian side, Perth, this is actually the deepest part of the whole Indian Ocean, down 14,000 feet in this great trenches on the south side of Australia. But the most famous feature of the ocean, which is on the surface and essential, is the monsoon cycle. So this is the seasonal change in the wind patterns driven by the sun and the rotation of the earth. And so there's this great circular change, so that the winds in the winter are coming off of the landmass and circulating in the western Pacific. But as soon as you get to the summer, then you get these southern winds coming up, and particularly raining all the way across from India down into Southeast Asia. So this is the lifeblood of many a nation, because particularly the agriculture of India and other nearby nations depends on the regular monsoon cycle. So you get tremendous amounts of rain. Even parts of Africa get quite a bit. The Arabian Peninsula tends to repel the monsoons just because of the rising heat, and helps in the upper atmosphere send the moist air and the water onto the Indian subcontinent and all around Southeast Asia. So this is again being watched by people there very much, because if the monsoon cycle and the intensity of it either increases or lessens, then this has implications for many, many people who live off of that weather pattern for agriculture. So, and a lot of it then runs into the Great Wall of the Himalayas, so that it drops precipitously and feeds all of the rivers that come all the way through from the Mekong to the Indus, the Ganges and such. But this is, again, a cyclical function of the planet, and if it changes, then this will be quite different. And the predictions are that there'll either be more flooding and more intense heat waves, or it'll begin to dry out and there'll be even more desertification, particularly in Pakistan and northern India. It is already happening. Or you're going to end up with drought in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, which is a great problem for the people and the wildlife there. So this is what happens up here when the moisture comes up from the south in the monsoon season. The Persian Plateau and the Arabian Peninsula, they radiate so much heat that actually pushes the weather on the jet streams and the higher atmosphere into Indian subcontinent and to the east to Southeast Asia. So this is over the Irrawaddy, where you're having a cyclone which will move to the northeast though the wind patterns will be counterclockwise in the sense that but the storms will generally come up and into either India, but particularly they get a lot into the Bay of Bengal and into Indonesia. So as you can see in this illustration, the monsoon is measurably coming up into areas. It weakens as it comes up into Himachal Pradesh and other parts of northern India. But where it gets the most rain is usually on the Ghats, on the mountain range on the west shore of the Indian subcontinent. So that's very lush, but on the other side of the mountains it's much drier. And these sort of local conditions are again, the lifeblood of many people. So when you're a resident over here or a sailor, you have to pay particular attention in the season, and now we have a lot better weather forecasting. So these storms will come in and roll through the sea, pick up more moisture, build a bigger cloud mass. Sometimes you start getting water spouts. They're just tornadoes of a low pressure system out at sea, and some of these are quite dangerous. Ships get picked up out of the water sometimes by these. And then the weather rolls onto land, and then it does its way. This is the cyclone that just hit in this area. That's Madagascar there, but it actually progressed over to Mozambique and did an unmeasurable amount of damage just in the last month. Again, the Seychelles did not get hit by that storm, but they get the weather. Sometimes these kind of storms, anywhere, they're called a typhoon in the Pacific, a hurricane in the Americas, but a cyclone here. They're all a low pressure storm system, but they can kick up what's called a sea foam, which is a curious kind of aerosol effect of a churning storm at sea. So that makes a little bit of fun out of what can be a lot of trouble. The other feature of the Indian Ocean are that there are volcanoes that ring it, sort of like the Ring of Fire in the Pacific, because you have active volcanoes from Indonesia, Krakatoa being the most famous one, all the way around to, this is on Reunion Island, and there are a few other active volcanoes here and there. And so I found in my studies that a sailor was out in the Indian Ocean, and he came across this curious looking bed of, he didn't know what it was. And this was actually pumice that had been thrown out of a volcano in Reunion and then ended up settling on the sea. And because pumice is so light, it actually floats. So here's the sailor in his private vessel saying, it looks like bread, but it doesn't taste the same. Yeah, oh well. But that's just one of the curious things about the ocean here. But most of these islands are coral atolls. The Seychelles, Reunion, Mauritius, where we're going, they are rocky volcanic islands. But to the northeast of Mauritius is the Chagos Archipelago, which is an array of coral atolls. Probably they were volcanoes that then dropped, and then they built a fringe reef around them, as is typical in other parts of the world ocean. But there are hundreds of these little islets all through this area. And some of them are developed, some of them are uninhabited at all. Some had population that were removed or that were brought in for labor. I'll talk about Mauritius, about the Chagos in particular, because there's a current issue that Mauritius, as an independent country, wants the Chagos group returned to their local control and not be a British overseas territory, and particularly a military base. But here's some of the other islands further up in the Bay of Bengal, off the coast of Thailand and Burma, Myanmar. The Andaman Islands, of which again there are hundreds of these little tropical islands. Again, some of them inhabited. That's where the most ancient of Indian Ocean peoples are, on the Andaman Islands, that are still living in the Stone Age isolation and protected by the Indian and Burmese government. Well, we were just here, the dramatic islands of the Seychelles, and these are very scenic, but again they're fringed with coral reefs in places, and that's what makes it such a dramatic place to visit. This is Sumatra, which is the vast island of part of Indonesia. Of course, Singapore is right there. But this is a very dramatic place with volcanic lakes, active volcanoes. But this line of islands out here is right where the Sunda Trench and the tectonic plates are active, and that's where the great earthquake of 2010 happened. Right off there was the center of it, but it completely washed over this whole area. And in this illustration, you can see the effect of it in the whole Indian Ocean. Particularly the east coast of India had great loss of life, but they felt it all in Somalia all the way around. It was actually even measured in the Atlantic Ocean because the effects were so strong that it went around as an eddy around the world. Well, this is studied because there'll be another one, and now there's a whole system of earthquake and tsunami warning system for Indonesia, India, and the African coast so that people can at least get away from the next one. Another part of the Indian Ocean is other than the Red Sea, is the Persian Gulf, which is this, we call it the Persian Gulf, but any Arab will call it the Arabian Gulf, by the way. They don't agree that it's part of Iran here. But this is the Strait of Hormuz, which is the critical entry for the Emirates and such, and the development up in that part of the world. But it's particularly critical military pinch point, which has international naval forces there to keep the commerce going and keep a watch on it. Another interesting part of the ocean is, of course, Sri Lanka. That's got it down there. But this particular piece of land and rocks and reefs, it's called Adam's Bridge. Actually, that's the name from Arabic. And it was considered a kind of a magical stepping stone. Depending on the tide, you can take boats and kind of cross over it, but it gets washed over by the sea. But this is famous in the Ramayana, where Rama and Varuna fought over Sita, and they crossed the bridge magically on a crocodile and saved the day. This, of course, is a complicated story, but when there was a proposal to build a causeway and a bridge over from the south tip of India to Sri Lanka, there was a great deal of objection because this is considered very sacred ground because of the Ramayana. And that's an example of how every culture all the way around the Indian Ocean has one way or the other a deep connection spiritually, economically to this ocean, provides life and sustenance and access to the rest of the world. And so the shoreline is an issue because many places the mangrove, which protect the land, have been torn out for development. The mangrove being particularly unusual, it can grow in salt water, it precipitates salt out of its leaves, and it can be blown with all of the leaves off in a storm, but it'll all grow back. And so all around the world they've been having restoration of mangrove for prevention of damage from hurricanes and cyclones. Well, now I'm going to take you down further to the Southern Ocean, but there are a few little islands in the deep sea down toward Antarctica, which are the remnant of the exploration period, where you have Ile Amsterdam and Kerguelen, and these are windswept, icy, cold places with no people, but they're still claimed as territory of France, or else the UK has a couple of islands around, and these are now just research stations and marine preserves mostly. There's a brief summer season where you can get there, but otherwise it's very hazardous, just like you're going down to Antarctica, where I worked for quite a few years. And but some people get used to it. Oh, those are penguins. Anyway, these are uninhabited by humans, but often there'll be 100,000 birds either flying, or these are king penguins coming up on shore. And so this one, explorers from all times and nationalities came down to Antarctica and to these parts of the world. They found species and habitats and things that are still quite fantastic. This is an illustration of just the bird life that they found in the Indian Ocean and different places. The most famous of which now extinct is the dodo bird that lived on islands in Mauritius and were a flightless bird that was easy pickings, and they were like the turtles of the Seychelles, picked up for food, and this bird went extinct. But others fly over, like the terns that fly from Antarctica to the Arctic, and different bird flyway. This is the most pelagic or migration of any bird on the planet, is this tern. And then there are all kinds of seabirds and gulls and frigate birds, albatrosses. Particularly go down to the Southern Ocean, you get a lot of more seabirds. Here's a curious photograph I found of a photographer who had a special time-lapse sensor. So that's only one or two birds flying, but it just captures the effort it takes to fly through the sky. But back to the ocean, there's endemic populations of hawksbill and other loggerback turtles that breed on the beaches and live in the Indian Ocean. But one of the unusual ones that has been found in the sea living is the Keleosant, which is a prehistoric style fish that has a fossil record going back some 200 million years. And they thought it was extinct until they caught one off the coast of South Africa. And they've since found a few others in deep sea fishing around the Indian Ocean. So this is an example where sort of a fish that lived with the dinosaurs and before is still alive in the depth of the sea. So when you go snorkeling, you may run into one. And of course, there's quite a bit of game fishing, groupers. A lot of it is catch and release now. I'm not sure whether the fish is going to let him go, though. So people come and do their marlin and their bill fishing here. Then the sea has its endemic populations of a whole series of dolphins, and the whales have returned. The Indian Ocean was pretty much whale out when the era of mechanized whaling happened. The Norwegian and then the Russian and other fleets came down and decimated the southern right whale and the blue whale. But these have rebounded with the International Whaling Commission's ban on catching certain species, and only a few nations like Iceland and Japan defy that ban. But nonetheless, most of the populations are increasing, except where their food supply has been taken by industrial fishing. Here's a humpback, which are famous for jumping. And then this is actually a fin whale, which I've never seen a picture of it leaping. They're usually on the surface, but they probably just wanted to get a good look at the boat nearby. And under the sea, there's all kinds of sharks, and but above all, coral reefs in so many parts of the Indian Ocean. And this, as you well know, is the habitat that is essential for most species to have either spawn or hide in the reefs. Much of them are being damaged by the heat and the bleaching, but there's still healthy places in the Seychelles and where we're going, Reunion and Mauritius. They have probably the most intact coral reef and fish populations because they have a small population. All of the reefs around the African coast are pretty much poisoned or destroyed by now. But if you're a diver or even a snorkeler, you can see all these parrotfish, dragonfish, all kinds of well-dressed fish in the coral reefs. And the Indian Ocean has some endemic crabs that are colorful. The hermit crab, the speckled crab, and here's one you don't want to meet at dinner, the Bathymenos gigantus. And this is an example of how some particularly deep sea creatures get very big and they get very angry when you pull them out of the water. But on the surface there's more jellyfish, jellies. They're not really a fish, of course. But here's providing habitat for other eggs and fish. This is a curious species that has been found recently. It's actually made of maybe 1 centimeter small jellies that then band together and tie together, and their string of cooperation can go for up to 30 to 40 meters. And these things are only this big, but they join together and then they float around and filter feed the plankton and such. But this is considered the longest of all creatures, except it's only this wide. And here's another one I found recently. It was found in the Indian Ocean. I don't have the scientific name for it, but it looks like a parrot, right? again, they just live in the abyss. And we keep finding more and more creatures in the dark zone or at the very depth of the bottom of the ocean that we couldn't imagine anything could live there. One thing is this, what's called the Globigirina ooze, which is a bottom-dwelling mat of plankton, which is sort of crawling around and feeding on each other. But this is something that is not on the beach. It's way down in the bottom of the sea, and it lives off what they call the ocean snow, which is the bit of precipitation of other plants and animals that when they are eaten or die, they go down and to the bottom where there's a whole other ecosystem that devours them. And one that was found is the size of a golf ball, rolls around and eats. But this is more familiar. You may have seen, anybody see these in the Seychelles? The great Aldabra tortoise that live on a number of different islands, and they now preserved because otherwise they were all being hunted and taken away for zoos and things. But just on the islands you get a lot of local lizards, chameleons, and they are part of the littoral shore ecology. And I showed this the other evening. In the Seychelles they have the great local palm, which has the world's biggest palm nut, and the coco de mer, which is the pride of the Seychelles. Other islands are not so full of wildlife, particularly the Maldives. Anybody been there? Which is to the north of Seychelles and south of India, as an independent nation of about 1,000 little islands, some of which were built, many of them are natural atolls. But it's an Islamic country, so they find enough ground to build tremendous mosques, and now they're part of the trade routes as they were traditionally across the Indian Ocean. So there's a lot of shipping that comes through, but above all, like the Seychelles, they're famous for their sandy beaches and their, let's say, warm welcome, and so it's become a major tourist development area. And they built up on many of the little islands resorts. Though, you know, this is a real question. Does tourism either help these places or does it make it bad impact, all the plastics and the consumption? So they have certain islands that are only landfill, while then they build more and more resorts that have more and more people fly in and have their magic honeymoon or their renewal of vows in places like this. But I found that they have now an underwater restaurant, in case you want a view of what you're maybe going to have. And so this is a marketing of the Maldives. I don't know whether this is true or one of those AI brochures like we get. But around the Indian Ocean, there's still very real people having a subsistence and having their local culture away from the international tourist circuit. But this is off of Zanzibar, this one little lodge on the beach. And many places you just have to go a little bit further, you find sea people who live on the sea, by the sea, and for the sea. This is Steve Curry's famous picture of the pole fishermen off of Sri Lanka. And then on the Indian shore you have, this is in Puducherry, you have such a big population that they have, again, a problem feeding themselves because the demand for food is so high and the sea is not replenishing as it was traditionally. But if you've never been here, I recommend going to Zanzibar, which is, of course, off the coast of Tanzania. Tanganyika joined with Zanzibar to become the country of Tanzania. But this is probably the most Indian Ocean historic site of all, because everybody from all these different parts of the Indian Ocean came to trade here. It was a part of Oman and run as a slave center for many centuries, but now as a sort of an independent historic city-state, it's a very vibrant place with the traditional fishing and boats there. And they take you out on sand spits and give you a meal out on the offshore islands, but it's sort of a place that has a great deal of history and life to it, and some traditional boats that are getting repaired. But meanwhile, the modernization is quite remarkable. Here in Maldives, you have half of the country's population is crammed onto this filled-in atoll, and you sort of wonder how this will be sustainable with the seas rising or other troubles, or even the weight of all this building. But the Maldives is a very progressive country trying to avoid the worst that could happen if the seas come out of control or there's tsunamis. So they already have problems with flooding, but they're building more protections, and they're fortifying certain islands just so that if there is undue weather, that they can at least take their people somewhere. But famously, the Prime Minister of the Maldives, he wrote a letter to the UN climate meeting that goes on every couple of years. But he did it stage underwater, saying, this is the fate of my country if we don't do something about the general global problem. Well, we have the same problem all over the world. Petroleum, pollution, increasing temperatures, sea level. This is Bay of Bengal and off the Indian east coast, where the air pollution and also the runoff from the rivers is severely impacting the whole ecosystem, the whole area. So this is where humans create a problem, and hopefully they can solve it. But for the ocean itself, this is the great piracy that I particularly object to, these great industrial fishing fleets that go out and take everything and process it on a ship and freeze it up and send it to the world market. So a lot of the countries in the Indian Ocean and around the world have been trying to oppose these, but it's out in international waters. It's very hard to stop. And there's no navy that actually intrudes with them until they come into territorial economic zones of the different countries. So this is a serious problem all around the world. So a colleague of mine, Susan Faraday, summed it up, says, water is going to do what water is going to do. The issue isn't the ocean, it's our responses and abilities to manage our own actions. So the research goes on to try to have data and precise measurement of all these changes in the ocean, so policy may be made and mistakes can be avoided. But there's always projects to improve these situation. So this is an example of a new kind of fish farming, which could be settled off the shore and then replace the wild catch. And they say that within a lifetime or two from now, there'll be no more wild fishing because it'll all be depleted, and we will have farm-raised tuna and other fish, groupers, and like we do salmon, and that will alleviate the pressure on the ocean and feed more people. And also islands that cannot sustain because sea level rise may build up in a way that they can house their people and live out on the islands still. There's a group called the Seastead Foundation, which has a competition for designing offshore habitats for population or relief efforts. Of course, you sort of wonder, how do that many people have enough food, or what are they doing for work? So a lot of this is imaginary, and some people call it a diversion from the real problem. But you, for a few million pounds, can buy your own little pod in the Indian Ocean. I don't know where this is proposed, but it looks like out of a cartoon fantasy where you come with a boat and go up your elevator and have your little pod on the ocean, but I don't think it's available yet. So you wonder what the traditional spirits of the Indian Ocean think about it. This is the great statue of Lord Shiva on Cape Comorin at the end of southern India. And on other shores, other people are looking out to the sea, as they've always done, and wondering what's going to happen and why are the problems coming up in ways that were not predicted. But the sea has its own way. And so I'll just show you just more pictures of the Indian Ocean and read a couple of sayings about it. There's magic in the distance where the sea line meets the sky. And to go to sea, why is it to have the experience of Noah, to realize the deluge? Every vessel is an ark. You must not lose faith in humanity. Humanity is an ocean of which a few drops are dirty. That does not mean the ocean becomes dirty. That was actually Mahatma Gandhi said that. And the earth and the ocean seem to sleep in one another's arms and dream. The heart is but the beach beside the sea that is the world. The care for anything is salt water, sweat, tears, or sea. That was Isaac Denison. And to travel the ocean leaves one speechless. And then one becomes a storyteller. That was from the great Arabic traveler Ibn Battuta, who a precursor to Marco Polo for the travels in the Indian Ocean. So I'll leave you with one view of the famous green flash, which we may see on a clear night on a calm sea. And it's, of course, a microsecond vision that you can only catch if you don't blink. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great trip on the Indian Ocean.